So today we're working on a 2002 Volkswagen Jetta TDI ALH. We're just going to start by doing some basic brake servicing and inspect the suspension components. We might find when we get into it that there's some parts that need to be replaced. If that's the case, we'll have to do this as a two-part video. Today we'll get everything apart and cleaned, and then I'll have to get parts ordered, and then we'll get it put back together. So just another little disclaimer for the audience. I just have a jack under here. Anytime you're working on your car, especially if you have your legs or your hands under it, you should put a safety stand underneath. In this case, I'm not going to do it because you have to go way higher with the jack for the stand to be able to fit, but don't do this at home. So this is what you'll be looking at when you get your wheel off, hopefully. The less rust, the better. A little bit of road dirt, obviously. So what you should be able to see here, hopefully, if your car has what it's supposed to have, there's little plastic or rubber plugs that keep the dirt out of the screws for the caliper. If you have these, you're in business. It's really easy to get the caliper off. If you don't have those, you'll have to likely take a small screwdriver or a pick and clean out the dirt out of the hex, because if you don't, when you try to put the bit in to undo the bolt, there's a good chance you'll twist it inside, and then you'll never be able to get the bolt undone without destroying this rubber boot that protects it. So we're going to try and get these undone now. It should be relatively easy since the dust boots are still intact. The only thing I don't know yet is whether the bolts are metric or imperial. The car is metric, but sometimes they don't fit quite right. Okay, so pull these little plugs out, top and bottom. You can tell these calipers aren't very old. Still got black paint on most of it, and the bleeder screw looks like it's in really good shape. So we shouldn't require a whole lot of work to do the servicing on this. Usually I believe these are supposed to be 7mm, but like I said, sometimes, and that's a perfect fit. So for future reference, it should be 7mm internal hex, but sometimes it requires a 1/4 inch to fit properly. 1/4 inch, this one. It just depends on the quality of the bolts and whether the calipers are original Volkswagen or an aftermarket brand. So I'm going to go ahead and try and get these undone here now. It shouldn't be too hard, I'm hoping. Oh, there we go. Another point of caution on these: if it's been a long time again since the calipers have been off last, or if you didn't have, I'm having some trouble with the bottom one here actually, or if you haven't got the rubber boots, you might find that the bolts do not want to undo easily, and there is also a risk then of twisting them off, and then you have to buy a new knuckle basically. Sometimes compressed air can be quite helpful to get the dirt and grime out of where you're trying to get the tool into. Try the bottom one here now. And not too bad at all. If you're lucky, you'll get to the point where you can just spin it with just your fingers. And what you're hoping to see when you pull these out is that there isn't any rust or corrosion on them. But again, that depends on how long it's been since they were serviced last. So pull these ones out here. So that one isn't too bad at all. A little bit of rust starting, and that's why we're doing this, is to get that cleaned up and stop it before it gets really bad. So that one's the upper. The lower one I can see already has quite a bit more rust than the top one did. So that is what causes the brake drag, because the caliper can't move back when you release the brakes. So we're going to make sure that's all cleaned up and put some new grease on it, and we should be in business. Okay, so if the caliper is free, then it should be easy to get off. This isn't supposed to do this. On this car, the rotor is supposed to be held in by a little screw. What happens usually is when people try and get the screw out, if it's been a long time, the screw just twists off, and then you're left with the threaded part stuck in the hub, and you can't put a new screw in unless you either spend time drilling it out or replace your hub. So this normally wouldn't be doing that. The caliper is coming off nice and easy here. This is your brake pad lining warning sensor. So in order for us to be able to work on the caliper, really, we'll probably have to take the sensor apart, and we'll get this one out of the way first. That just has clips on the back that hold it into the caliper. You can't mix these ones up, which is nice. Some cars, the pads are the same, so you want to keep them the way they came off. Inner to the inner and outer to the outside. So that's ready for us to service, and by the look of it, it's in really good shape. So all we're going to do basically when we get to it is push the piston out a bit by pressing the brake pedal, pull the boot back and blow out any dirt, put a little bit of brake fluid in for lubrication, and then work the piston in and out a couple of times and make sure that it's good and free. I'm just going to hang it up here for the minute, if it'll sit there for me, and we'll unplug the brake pad sensor here, which all Volkswagen clips for this generation have a little tab on the top that you're supposed to be able to pull, and you should hear a little click, and then the plug should slide off of, I don't have enough hands, the plug should slide off of the rest of it like that. And again, a little note, if you think about it before you get into this, take your garden hose and wash out the wheel well so that you're not dealing with all your road dirt. I live on a gravel road, so that's a normal thing for me. If you live in the city or you're on a paved road, you'll be just fine. Might as well take the rotor off since it's loose and just see if the screw is missing or if...
Looks like it's broken off.
I don't have my little screwdriver here, but yes, I think based on that, the threads of the screw are actually broken off inside there. So we won't be able to do that today. I have had luck in the past drilling them out, but it is a really difficult job, and you don't want to damage the threads that are in the hub if you're trying to drill out that screw. So it's better to just wait in this case till you have to do a wheel bearing, and when you do that, you get a new hub, and then you can put a proper screw in it. Okay, so while we've got the caliper and the rotor off, we're just going to take a quick look at the suspension components, starting with the spring, I guess, up here. It's hard to see because of the road dirt, but all you're looking to know is that, for one, that the top is still intact. You can see the spring is going right to the top disc up there, as long as that's still in place. And at the bottom here, you can see, you might not be able to see in the camera, but on the far side, the coil goes around and stops where it's supposed to be, and there's no brakes in it. If you got a broken coil, the most that's going to result is your car is going to be slightly lower on this corner. If you're looking to get a safety done like I'm going to do, they won't pass it with any kind of a broken spring, front or back. So I'm glad to see in this case that the front is in good shape. And the other thing then to look at is the control arm down here. This rear bushing is the common one that goes. If you can see there, there's no cracks in the rubber. It looks like it's in good shape. That's the primary one. There is a bushing on the front side of the control arm. They usually have some cracking in them, but it takes a lot of wear before they're a problem. And then the last thing to look at on the control arms, if you can see there, I have to come in from the side. There's a ball joint here, and you're just looking that the rubber boot is still intact. When they do the safety, they'll check for any play in any suspension or steering components, but at least ahead of time you can check that everything looks the way it should. Okay, so when you're looking at a caliper and you're talking about brake drag, which not only does that reduce your fuel economy, but it creates unnecessary heat and also wears out your brake pads way faster. There's two things that it can be caused by. One is these slider bolts that we took out at the beginning. They go inside the rubber boot here, and what happens is the caliper itself rusts and corrodes on the inside between the rubber and the metal, and that makes the hole smaller, and then the pin won't slide anymore. That's one cause, usually the main cause. The other cause, when calipers are getting towards the end of their life, is the boot isn't keeping the dirt and water out anymore. And if water gets inside there, then your piston starts to rot on the inside and it will just seize in the caliper. And then you push your brake pedal, which has enough hydraulic pressure to push the piston out, but it doesn't come back when you release the brake pedal. So based on the age of these calipers, I'm going to say we're not going to have any trouble with the piston, but I just pulled back the boot a little bit and I'm seeing a little bit of rust on the inside. So I think we're going to take the boots out just to make sure that everything's clean on the inside, and put that back together with a little bit of anti-seize on them. And then we'll look at doing the piston. So I'm just going to see if this will come out of here relatively easily for me, which it looks like it is. So aside from the road dirt I just put on it, anywhere that's black, you know, it's still a painted surface in here, but there is a little bit of rust starting, and someone folded over the boot when they put it in, so you want to make sure that things like that don't happen. So that's the upper, and then we'll do the lower one here, which hopefully will be just as easy. Yeah, and that one you can see pretty much perfectly clean, like new still. So if you can see in there, there is a little bit of rust on the one side there. This one, it's pretty much completely new black painted metal. So that one we probably won't do anything with other than clean up the boot. This one I'm going to try and find a little wire brush to try and get the rust out of there. And then we'll put the boots back in, and that pretty much will do it for the sliders. Later on we'll clean up the rust on those slide bolts we talked about, and then we'll look at the piston. Okay, so what you're going to want to try and find, if you can see any rust in your caliper loops here, is some kind of a cylinder brush, or like a giant pipe cleaner, but you want metal bristles of some kind. If the rust is really bad, you can cut the loop off the other end and put it in a drill, and you spin it and go through and back. In this case, I think this one's pretty good, so I'm just gonna put it in and out a couple of times by hand. And as long as there's no real shale left inside, which it looks like most of the rust is gone just from doing that, and everything is smooth. Basically, you're just looking to see that the surface inside is still perfectly smooth. If there's any shale, you want to get rid of that, because that's going to cause your slide bolts to seize up eventually. So looking at these ones, they're in great shape. Like, the caliper still has all of the paint on it. So I'm going to say that that's good as is. And just before I cleaned up the boots here, I got dirt on me again now. I cleaned up the boots so that they're perfectly clean, no rust. And what I'm going to do before I put them back in is just use some of the anti-seize compound, which I'll show you here. Garages will tell you not to use this, but if you want to be able to get anything undone the next time you go to service your own car, even to change a tire, if you have to change a flat tire on the side of the road and your wheel bolts are stuck, then what are you going to do? So I always put a little bit of this on all threads and any surface that you don't want the metal to corrode. So that's what we're going to be using. And we can put the boots back in here now. So all I'm going to do is put a little coating, and you have to kind of think about how you want to do this for putting them back in so that you don't get anti-seize all over yourself and everything else, because it's terrible stuff to get off. So the boot goes like that, and it's probably going to be easiest to, might even be easiest to slide it in that way, I'm not sure. Either way, you got to decide ahead of time where you're going to put the anti-seize on, because if you put it on a surface and then you got to slide the boot through, then you've got the boot all covered in anti-seize, which you don't want. So in this case, I don't know what's going to be easier. I don't know if I can make it go through here. Oh, it's pretty tough. And of course, if there's anti-seize on this surface, then you've got it all over your hand again now. So certainly not easy. Sometimes what you have to do is try and fold it in half, which of course this one won't let me do it. You do a little fold like that, Stop. Oh my goodness. And then you can kind of stick it through, hopefully without it springing before you can get it in. These ones are being really tough. You can use a screwdriver or a tool. You just want to make sure that you're not poking a hole in the boot or scratching the metal surface on the inside at the same time. This one is really not cooperating with me today. So in this case, I think what we're going to have to do is put the anti-seize inside the caliper, and then there'll be some excess on the inside to wipe off once you've done that. I'm just going to put some inside here. So it's often good to have some kind of a brush, either a toothbrush or a paintbrush that you can apply the anti-seize with so you don't end up with way more than you need. So now I'll try and see if it's going to be a little nicer to slide in. Sometimes rotating it helps, and there you go. So a little bit of lubrication popped right in. You didn't get it all over yourself or anywhere else, a little bit on my finger. And the little bit of extra around the outside is fine. It keeps the metal insulated from all the dirt and the water. So that one's good to go. We'll try and see if we can be just as successful on the other one here. You want to make sure there isn't any dirt in there, obviously, or that just makes your life more difficult to try and get these in. A little bit like that. And see if I can be just as successful with this one. Come on. Working with the other hand too doesn't help any. Rotate it as you go. And that one, there you go too. This one, when someone installed the boot the last time, they didn't make sure that the rubber was in all the way, so it ended up folding it over and creasing it. So you want to keep those little details in mind. It saves you a lot of hassle later. If the boot's folded over, it means it's not keeping the dirt and water out, which is defeating the whole purpose. So those are all done now, and when we put the slide bolts in, we'll put some silicone grease, which I'll show you later, on those sliders. You don't want to use anti-seize on them because anti-seize dries out eventually. So we're going to set this up out of the way for a minute, hopefully without putting dirt into what I just did. And I need a bigger wire brush. Well, you've got everything out of the way here. These slide points are where both the pads and the calipers rest. So if there's any rust or shale or lumps, even if your sliders and your piston are completely free, these won't let your pads release and you'll still have brake drag. So you just want a big wire brush for this part. If you don't have the rotor off because it's got the screw in and you didn't want to touch it, then you might have to look at a smaller brush. But in this case, I can make sure that these are nice and clean. You don't want any rust, and if there's lumps, sometimes it's good to take a hammer, a ball peen hammer, and just knock that shale off so that you don't have anything causing issues with sliding. And I will also put anti-seize on these surfaces before we put it back together as well. And then while I'm here, also I'm going to do the surfaces for the caliper mounting. And these threaded ears here are where those slide bolts thread into and tighten up. So you want to make sure that those surfaces are clean. Again, air to clean up the rust and make sure the threads are all cleaned out. And while I'm here, I might as well do the rotor a little bit, or a hub here a little bit, to make sure that the rotor doesn't get seized on. That's also another reason to make sure this is clean when you're doing this, because I was almost expecting when I was doing this wheel that I wouldn't be able to get the wheel off the hub. If you can get the wheel bolts undone or nuts undone, that's one half the battle. But if your rim is seized on the hub here, you're still not going to be able to change your tire. So it's good to keep the rust off of here, and I always put anti-seize on this part as well and on the hub. Somebody put some grease on here, you can see. But anything like that, just to keep the rotor and the rim from rusting to the hub, it's going to make your life a lot easier in the future. Clean it up a little bit like that. Again, making sure the threads are clean. The primary part, if you cross thread or strip a thread, you're into a lot more money and time as well. So. Okay, so now that we've got our slide boots cleaned and anti-seized and put back in, and we cleaned up the caliper mounting bracket already, now we're going to take a quick look at the caliper piston here, make sure that it's in good shape on the inside, and add a little bit of brake fluid for lubrication if we need to. So I think actually right off the bat here we need to move the piston out a little bit, so I'm going to get my partner here to go into the car and just push the brake pedal. Just put one foot in if you can. And just gently push it, I'll tell you how far. You got to go a little further. Okay, yeah, a little more. One more. That's just a little bit more. You have to be careful when you're doing this, because if you go too far the piston will pop out. That's good. So you want to get it out far enough that you can get a hold of the boot and it's kind of spread out a little bit, but not so far that you risk popping the piston out and then you have brake fluid everywhere and get to start again. So I'm just going to take my compressed air here, pull the boot back. You can see already there's a little bit of, if you can see, there's a little bit of rust in the groove there, but behind that the piston looks like brand new metal, which is what you want to see. Someone nicked it there, there's a little chip out of it, which that will cause problems on the seal inside, but for the most part it's not in bad shape at all. I'm going to pull the boot back. So that's not too bad at all by the look of that. So then we're going to put a little bit of brake fluid. Grab the container there with the red lid. Yep. A little bit of brake fluid. I usually use a little syringe. Container open here. Usually use a little syringe, and you just pull the boot back, stick the syringe in there, and you're just going to put some in until you see it start to come out around the syringe. So you can have one side I can see. You don't have to put a lot in. You're just looking to lubricate the seal and the piston so that when you push it back in, it's not going in dry, which just hurts the seal and shortens the life of the caliper. I'm just going to put a little more in here. I'd like to see it coming out the front before I say that we're good. If you go too fast, you will end up with it everywhere. Be careful of that. And there it comes up like that. Brake fluid will not hurt anything rubber, but it will take your paint off. So if you do have nice painted calipers or knuckles or anything like that, then it will take the paint off. So if you're worried about that, you just make sure that you wipe up the brake fluid afterwards and use a little bit of brake parts cleaner if you need to. So I think for this one being in as good a shape as it is, one shot of brake fluid will be all it needs. And now we're going to use the C-clamp vice grips. Yep. So you want a pair of these or something similar. You can probably use, like, they don't have to be the clamping style, any kind of a C clamp like this. And on these ones, unfortunately, the mounting fastener there is right in the way for where you want to put this. So it makes it a little more challenging. If the caliper is really free, like I'm thinking this one is, you might even be able to do it on the side. Another point that I'm just realizing here now, if your piston is deeper than the length of the clamp, then it ends up pushing on the side instead of in the middle where you want it to push. So in this case, you need some kind of a spacer. I think I actually have a a little block that we made for that. So I'm going to go and get that and then we'll resume here.